Our next speaker is Alyssa Billingsley, PharmD. She's the Director of Program Development at GoodRx. GoodRx is a company we love as physicians because it helps our patients get their drugs at fair prices. With over a decade of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, she speaks on topics including pharmacovigilance, drug development, and even the COVID vaccine. Dr. Billingsley has made it her quest to find out where medications come from so that we can stay safe and forever young. Without further ado, here's Dr. Billingsley.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Alyssa Billingsley, and I am the Director of Strategic Program Development and a pharmacist on the research team at GoodRx. And today I'm going to be presenting on how safe is your medication, the role of the FDA in protecting the public. Okay, so before we go ahead and get started, I'm going to walk through a few objectives to start. So first, I want you to be able to understand the roles and responsibilities of the FDA for ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of drug products distributed in the United States. So we'll be walking through the different functions of the FDA, starting with the approval of new drugs, monitoring the facilities manufacturing them, and tracking any new adverse events or concerns that come up after approval. Secondly, you'll learn about how drugs are approved for human use, including the differences between new or brand medications and generic approvals. Next, we'll be touching on emergency use authorizations, or EUAs, that are currently in effect during the pandemic and how they differ from the full approval process and why they might be used. Next, I want you to understand why drugs may be recalled or withdrawn from the market and what that means for patients. So I'll actually give a few examples of when that has happened recently. And lastly, you'll learn how the FDA reviews and responds to potential risks and new safety information for drugs. So first, we'll start out with the basics. Most of you are probably familiar with the FDA, but you may not know the full scope of what they do to make sure our medications are safe and effective. So the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, is a regulatory agency that regulates a wide range of products. Today we'll be focusing on human drugs, but they also oversee veterinary drugs, cosmetics, foods, medical devices, and other products as well. They also regulate supplements too, but that's under a different set of regulations. And so they do a lot in this respect, but we'll be focusing on three roles in particular. The first being reviewing and approving new drugs. And so when we talk about a drug being FDA approved, it's for specific use, dosing, and within certain populations. Next, we'll walk through how they register and inspect facilities. So a big part of drug safety is obviously that the facilities manufacturing the medications are doing so in a way to ensure that they meet strength and potency requirements and they aren't contaminated before they get to you. And lastly, they ensure the safety, efficacy, and security of drugs. So we'll walk through drug recalls, market withdrawals, and safety signals. So first we'll start with reviewing and approving drugs. So first, when a drug is approved, it goes through a new drug application process, or NDA. But before it gets to that point and gets actually tested within humans, there will be some preclinical testing. And a lot of times that will happen in animals, and that is mostly used to determine safety, so how the drug is being absorbed, broken down, and removed or excreted from our bodies. And also, most drugs actually don't make it beyond this point. And so assuming something looks really promising, the drug sponsor may file what's called an investigational new drug application, or an IND. And this is where they show the FDA the results from the animal testing and how they plan to actually test the medication within humans. And so the FDA reviews all this information, and they determine whether or not it's safe to move forward with human trials. And so once we get to that point, the FDA approves the IND application. It goes through clinical trials. We're focused on phase 1, 2, and 3. So phase 1 is generally in a smaller group of healthy people. And so they're just making sure that the drug is going to be safe and figure out some of the dosing that will be used. Second, phase 2 is generally in a larger group of people with the condition. And so here we're focusing more on efficacy and side effects, since we are looking at the drug within people who have the condition, seeing if it works for that particular condition. And then phase 3 is with an even larger group of people with the conditions, looking at efficacy again, as well as adverse reactions. And we'll touch on this again later in the presentation. But when you have a smaller group of people, some of the more rare side effects or adverse events may not show themselves. And so when you open it up to a larger group of people, some of those things may come to light. And so assuming everything looks good, it appears to be effective to treat the condition, appears to be safe, the drug sponsor will file a new drug application or an NDA. And this is where they ask the FDA for approval. And so through this, the FDA reviews this information from the animal testing, from the human trials, to see if the benefits outweigh the risks and if the drug is safe and effective for its intended use. So once a new drug is approved, what happens? So the FDA has determined that it's safe and effective for its intended use in a specific condition and population. And so again, most drugs are not tested in certain populations like children or pregnant people. And so it may not be indicated within those populations. And so, the FDA also approves labeling along with, as part of the drug approval process. And so that labeling actually, lays out how the drug is to be used and how it's approved to be used. So when we talk about drug safety and use the word safe, it doesn't mean that there aren't risks, but there is ongoing monitoring of the drugs after approval, and as well as in the approved labeling. That actually lays out how you can identify these risks and how to manage some of these risks as well. So once a drug is approved, prescribers can use their clinical judgment to prescribe the medication. Sometimes this is done outside of the approved labeling. So like I've said, a lot of medications are approved for use in adults, but not children. And so prescribers may actually choose to use them in children or other populations or for other conditions that weren't approved. And this is called off-label prescribing. And this is perfectly legal and actually very common. 1 in 5 prescriptions written in the US is for an off-label use. Lastly, the brand manufacturer does get some exclusivity to market the medication for a period of time without any sort of generic or lower cost competitors in the market. So there is an incentive to go through this drug approval process with that respect. So next we'll get into generic medications. So previously, generic medications needed to go through those preclinical and clinical trials like the brands, but the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984 established this new process called the Abbreviated New Drug Application, or ANDA process, that actually made it a lot easier for generics to get approved. So, prior to this, there weren't a lot of generics out on the market. After this, the generic drug industry boomed and has really brought us to where we are here today, with about 80 to 90% of prescriptions being filled in this country for generic medications. Now, through the ANDA process, companies don't need to repeat the animal and human research, but they do need to show that the drug is therapeutically equivalent to the brand. So this means that it has the same actives, dosage form, strength, and route as the brand, and that it's absorbed similarly in the body and gets to the same targets as the brand drug. And so I've kind of laid out the different parameters that the FDA is looking for whenever an ANDA application is submitted. And so again, same actives, dosage form, strength, and route, has the same time release technology. There may be some variability in the inactive ingredients that are used, or excipients or binders that are used in the medication, but they need to make sure that they are safe and they don't actually change how the drug works in your body. Again, they need to be able to produce the same result as the brand drug, have the same label, that the product has, a good shelf life, so it doesn't, break down quickly, how it's being packaged and put together, that the manufacturer can make the drug correctly and consistently, that the drug is being shipped and stored appropriately, and lastly, making sure that those patents and legal exclusivities that the brand has are expired. And so they are able to manufacture and distribute these generic products. So we'll walk through a few brand versus generic frequently asked questions. So a big question is probably, are generic drugs different from their brand versions? And so, very technically speaking, generic drugs are modeled after their brand versions. So they should work the same way and provide the same clinical benefit. But as I, spoke to earlier, they are not identical, or they may not be identical. And so again, they may have different inactive ingredients, binders, fillers, et cetera, in the way that they're put together. So can there be some variability? Yes, there can. So this tends to be small and not medically important, according to the FDA. But of course, there are some exceptions to that, and we'll get into that here shortly. And so a large study showed that there was about a 3.5% difference in how generic drugs were absorbed by the body compared to the brand. So are there times when you should be taking the brand or may need to? And so yes, there are. The first and probably most obvious reason is that there are no generic versions available. So if a medication is only available as a brand, you really don't have any options there. Secondly, it's a narrow therapeutic index drug. And so this is when small differences may lead to some issues. And so there's a small margin in dosing between the therapeutic and toxic doses. And so these types of drugs include some seizure medications, thyroid medications, and medications used in organ transplant. And lastly, you may just not do as well in the generic version, or you may be allergic to one of those inactive ingredients. And so those are just a few examples of why you may need to take the brand version instead. So what types of drugs are being approved? So let's start by looking at the years 2000 to 2008. So during this time, neurological drugs, so drugs to treat depression, for example, and cancer medications were at the top, followed by cardiovascular drugs and biologics. And then you've got antibiotics and antivirals, and then everything else. So moving forward to the years 2009 to 2017, we do see a shift towards more anti-cancer and biologics, with a decline in cardiovascular and neurological drugs. And also during this time, more new drug applications were actually being submitted as well. And so one of the reasons we saw, this shift happened is that the FDA does offer fast track, breakthrough therapy, priority review, and accelerated approval paths for novel treatments to bring them to people more quickly. So for example, there may be drugs that help meet unmet medical needs or show a significant benefit or over currently available therapies, or offer significant advancements in medical care. And so there is an incentive to move forward with these drugs and get them accessible faster. So the FDA may review portions of the drug application ahead of time. So rather than waiting to the end, they're more involved in the process. They provide intensive guidance through the process. They may cut down the target review time from the standard 10 months or so down to 6 months, or they may approve drugs early to help bring some of these drugs to the market faster. But not all drugs may go through the FDA approval process right away, especially when there is a public health emergency. So we've actually seen this happen during the current pandemic to get people access to treatments, tests, and vaccines more quickly without necessarily being part of a clinical trial in some cases. So in this case, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services can give the FDA the ability to temporarily authorize products during an emergency. So when we talk about some of the diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines used during COVID-19, they are not FDA approved, at least not yet. They can be authorized through what is called an emergency use authorization or an EUA. But when the public health emergency is over and they haven't actually pursued full FDA approval, they can no longer be used. But not just anything can get authorized. So it's not like you can say, hey, I have this new, medication or test or vaccine. I'm just going to start, using it or releasing it into the public. That's not an option, how it works. And so companies do still need to submit information for the FDA to review. And the FDA then makes a decision based on the best available data at the time to determine if benefits outweigh the risks. So these EUAs can be approved, changed, or revoked at any time by the FDA. And we've seen that kind of happen over the course of this time. So for example, there was an EUA for hydroxychloroquine, but when it became apparent that, it wasn't as effective for its use, the FDA revoked that EUA. There are some, or actually one in particular, that has since gone on to become FDA approved, that being remdesivir. So next we'll move to registering and inspecting facilities. So an important part of drug safety is ensuring that the manufacturer making the drug meets quality requirements. So this is to make sure that the product that you receive has the right active ingredients and the correct strengths, and that it isn't contaminated with something that could be potentially harmful. So facilities that are manufacturing, repackaging, or relabeling drugs for distribution within the United States need to register with the FDA, and this is renewed annually. They also need to submit a list of their drug products, I believe twice annually as well. And the FDA can inspect these facilities at any time, and they must comply with what is called the Current Good Manufacturing Practices, or CGMPs. And so just to kind of walk through what some of those components are, it's that you document your policies, procedures, and processes and follow them in a way that you operate. Sometimes these facilities may be sourcing ingredients from manufacturers elsewhere. And so they need to make sure they are of good quality, they aren't contaminated. And so if they don't, for example, you can run into problems, which we will touch on here shortly. We also need to make sure that they are manufacturing a good quality product and that they have robust testing as well, because a big part of CGMPs is product testing, both throughout the manufacturing process and of the final product to detect any quality deviations. And this is to catch a lot of the issues before they actually make it to the consumer. And lastly, being able to detect and investigate any quality deviations that are found. And so this really goes hand in hand with product testing, ensuring that they're able to identify these issues and investigate what may be causing them. So where are these facilities located? So in 2018, it was estimated that 60% of drug manufacturers providing drugs for the US were actually located overseas, which constitute about 40% of finished drugs and 80% of active ingredients. And so most of these facilities are located in China and India. Also, some people are proposing that we import finished drugs from Canada. So as opposed to having FDA registered facilities in other countries, but actually importing finished drugs from Canada as a way to reduce drug costs, since they do tend to be quite cheaper than here in the US. Certain states have been pursuing legislation to make this possible through an importation plan. Each proposal needs to be submitted and approved by the Secretary of DHHS. And I believe that as far as we're concerned right now, is that they're all just waiting for feedback at this point. So as I've said earlier, the Hatch-Waxman Act opened up the generic drug market to tremendous growth. And we've seen an increase in overseas drug manufacturing facilities through this time as well. So now these facilities can pose some challenges for the FDA, and it has not been without issues. So to start, the FDA can show up anytime at a facility within the United States, but historically speaking, they would give advance notice to facilities located in other countries. So an analogy that I like to use here is that when you know that someone's coming over to your house to visit, you have a chance to make sure that it looks clean and orderly, but on any other given day, it might be a total mess. So on the other hand, if you may have companies stop by randomly, just drop in, you want to make sure that it's clean or at least put together, you're doing what you need to do every day in the off chance that you'll have visitors. And so what has happened is that, with these announced inspections of overseas facilities, it does give you some time to kind of go through and say, okay, what are they going to be looking at? Clean up, fix any issues ahead of time when, every other time maybe there were some problems. So what FDA inspectors found is that some of these facilities were using lower quality or unapproved ingredients for manufacturing and manipulating or falsifying data. And there was actually a book recently published that covered some of these issues. So in response, the FDA has increased the number of inspections of overseas facilities to the point where they're actually, exceed the number of inspections of facilities within the United States, with an increase in unannounced inspections. And so in particular with one particular manufacturer in India, in response to some of these violations that they had discovered, the company actually ended up pleading guilty as part of one of the largest drug settlements or drug safety settlements, and paid a fine of $500 million. And so furthermore, the FDA has also banned several of their facilities from providing drugs to the United States. Next, we'll go into ensuring safety, efficacy, and security of drugs. So it's important to understand that after a drug has been approved, it continues to be monitored as it becomes widely used by the public. So sometimes unacceptable health risks may be unveiled as it is used in people beyond those in the clinical trials, or sometimes manufacturers or the FDA find an issue that needs to be fixed. So next, we'll discuss three mechanisms that are used to help protect the public from potential harm, including recall, market withdrawal, and safety signals. So first, starting with drug recalls, they are voluntary removal of a defective product from the market. This can be initiated by the company or requested or mandated by the FDA. And so the FDA's role in this process is to make sure that the company is handling the recall appropriately. So how would you know if a drug has been recalled? So sometimes there may be a public notification by the company, usually if this is more widespread, serious, impacting large numbers of people. There may be an announcement by the FDA via the news or other media. They also release enforcement reports, and they also have a Twitter account that you can follow as well with this information. Or you may be directly notified by the manufacturer, healthcare provider, or pharmacist. And so a few general reasons why a drug may be recalled is for safety reasons, obviously to prevent further harm, mislabeling, contamination, or variance in strength or potency. And so this can be due to the product itself or the labeling and or packaging of the product as well. So you may be asking, are all drug recalls serious? Not necessarily. There are actually 3 recall classes depending on how serious it is. The first being class 1, which is the most serious. This is where the issue can lead to serious health problems or death. The next is class 2, which is actually the most common type of recall. And this is where the issue may cause temporary reversal health problems and has a slight threat of serious nature. The last is class 3, which is the least serious. And this is where the issue is unlikely to cause adverse health reactions, but ultimately it violates labeling or manufacturing laws. And so they do need to fix that issue. And so what should you do if your medication is recalled? So first, you may want to check to see if your specific medication has been impacted. Many times recalls impact only certain batches of a medication, and you'll typically be able to access a list of lot numbers affected by the recall, and you can check this information on your bottle. So sometimes your pharmacy may get your medication from a larger stock bottle, and so you may actually need to call them to see which lot you received. And they may have unaffected lots of medication as a replacement as well. You also want to make sure to talk to your healthcare provider, since many medications are critical for your health. You typically don't want to stop taking them without talking to your provider first, and they may be able to prescribe you an alternative medication if it's appropriate. So next, we will walk through a notable drug recall that affected a few medications that are used to treat high blood pressure and heart failure, and that being angiotensin II receptor blockers, or ARBs. So back in 2018, there were recalls of a few ARBs, including valsartan, losartan, and irbesartan, in addition to some combination medications containing those ingredients. So it was discovered that certain batches of these medications contain impurities called nitrosamines like NMDA, NDEA, and NMBA that are either probable or potential carcinogens or things that can increase your risk of cancer. And so it was believed that this issue actually dated as far back as 4 years prior. And at least initially, this stemmed from the raw ingredient manufacturer. So you remember we touched on ensuring that you're obtaining quality raw ingredients for manufacturing. This was, an example of when that caused an issue because there was an issue with the raw ingredient. So now you may be thinking this sounds really dangerous. And yes, consuming large amounts of nitrosamines over a long period of time can definitely be an issue. But we actually do consume low levels of them because they're actually found in some water supplies and foods. But the FDA actually defines acceptable levels in these cases. And so in the cases of these medications, the levels were found to be in excess of what is considered to be reasonably safe for humans. So what did the FDA do here? So to start, they investigate the issue and try to figure out how it happened, which medications have been affected, and what is the actual risk or impact to patients. So through this process, impacted lots of medication were recalled, and they also maintained a list of batches that were confirmed to not contain these contaminants. And so they were actually testing these batches to make sure, which ones had them and which ones didn't, and making that public available. So they also discovered that the impurities may have, at least in part, been created during the manufacturing process. Again, certain things can happen that may not be anticipated. And so this is possible, but it is possible to actually manufacture these medications without creating these impurities, because of course we do have manufacturers and batches that don't have them. And so the FDA also inspected these manufacturing facilities to make sure that they are following CGMP standards, because again, having good, robust testing processes is key. And that's actually how this issue was identified in the first place. One of the manufacturers getting the raw ingredient from another manufacturer had tested and found these contaminants in their products. And so they also wanted to put some context around the risk, really assessing that the risk to patients based on the maximum possible exposure. So if you were taking the highest strength medication and getting the most amount of these nitrosamines over this potentially, 4-year period, that your actual risk or increased risk of cancer was very, very small. So what did this mean for patients? So realistically, if you were filling a prescription during this time for one of these medications, chances are you may not have always received an impacted lot. And the FDA, again, advised patients to keep taking their medication until their provider or pharmacist could give them a replacement or a different treatment option. So your next question might be, what is being done to prevent this from happening in the future, or maybe even something worse? And so the FDA has been working with manufacturers and the supply chain to remove any affected medications so they don't, reach any more patients. And they've also been inspecting and citing these facilities to make sure that they're in compliance with CGMP. And they've also focused on ensuring that processes are in place to identify these potential impurities, because again, this wasn't necessarily something that was anticipated to be a byproduct of manufacturing. And so since this initial ARB recall, they've identified similar issues in medications like ranitidine, which goes by the brand name Zantac, which is an over-the-counter medication used to help treat acid reflux, as well as metformin, which helps control blood sugar in type 2 diabetes. So next we'll move on to market withdrawal. So how is this different? Market withdrawal is when a product is taken off the market, and this can be done because the company needs to correct a minor issue. It can also be done for safety reasons. So the company may also withdraw a product because, they may have declining sales and they say, you know what, it's not worth it to keep making this medication. We're going to remove it from the market entirely. And so a market withdrawal can actually start as a recall. to protect the public if it could potentially cause harm and ultimately be completely removed from the market. So one example of a notable recall that has happened for safety reasons is the medication Vioxx. And that may sound familiar to you. So Vioxx was an anti-inflammatory medication that's used to treat different types of arthritis, acute pain, menstrual pain, and migraine. So the manufacturer had actually withdrew Vioxx from the market back in 2004 after a study showed that people taking this medication long-term actually doubled their risk of heart attack compared to people receiving placebo. So again, for safety reasons, they decided to withdraw the medication from the market. So next are safety signals. So, as we're going through this ongoing monitoring of drug safety after approval, sometimes adverse events may come up, and so those need to be reported to the FDA. This is done sometimes by pharmaceutical companies, providers, consumers, and so this information is actually searchable using the FDA Adverse Events Reporting System, or FAERS, public dashboard. And so the FDA takes the information from the system to identify potential signals of serious risks or new safety information. And this information is actually evaluated by the FDA to determine if the drug is associated with the risk that's being reported. And so what if the FDA does find that this drug is associated with the risk? So they do have a couple different tools or methods or processes on how to manage this. And so they may decide we just need to update the labeling. And so they may update the medication labeling to include these newly identified risks. They may require a REMS, or a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, which is a drug safety program required by the FDA. And so this may include a med guide, which is a handout given to patients when the medication is dispensed. It may include training and certification of providers, specific patient testing or monitoring, just to give a few examples of what that might entail. They may decide to remove the drug from the market. So again, if they have all these reports of these serious issues, they find that, yes, the drug is associated with this, and through their review, they may advise that the drug is removed from the market. They may also need to just gather more information. So, we have this information and they need to better characterize the risk to patients. So here are a few potential causes of safety signals that can include, but are not limited to. So again, a lot of times it's an adverse reaction. There may be some allergies, drug interactions, and may interfere with certain procedures or lab tests. There may be some quality or dosing issues, preparation errors, medication errors, therapeutic inequivalence. Again, maybe the drug, maybe the labeling. Sometimes the labeling can be confusing, so people are using it incorrectly. And so all these are some examples of when safety signals may come up. So we'll walk through a few FAQs before we wrap up. So is the FDA slow at approving new drugs? I think we probably hear that a lot. And actually, compared to other countries, the FDA process can actually be faster. They do have expedited pathways for certain drugs to get to the public faster, as we've kind of discussed earlier. So drugs for cancer, rare diseases that maybe there aren't a lot of patients, and so there's some incentives to develop new treatments for those conditions. Next, why do new adverse reactions pop up after a drug has been approved? So again, when you're testing a drug or studying a drug within a clinical trial, it's within the confines of a smaller group in a more controlled environment. And so when the medication starts to be used in the broader population, new, rare adverse reactions can be uncovered. And so that is why ongoing monitoring of drug safety is important. Lastly, can there be adverse reactions that happen but aren't from taking the drug? Yes. So just because there is correlation does not mean that there is causation. And so, within normal process, we expect a certain number of events to happen within a population normally. So we'll have heart attack, stroke, death, things like Bell's palsy, for example, which has come up, that happen normally. And so just because it happened within someone taking the medication doesn't necessarily mean that the medication is what caused that. And so there does need to be further investigation to confirm if it's actually from taking the drug. So a few main takeaways. So I think it's really important to note that the FDA is by no means perfect. And I think we've kind of walked through a lot of the processes and some of the issues that have come up over time. And they do rely on studies and information from drug sponsors as well. But hopefully this has helped you get a better idea of some of their more significant functions and roles in drug safety. So all drugs have risks, like we've said. So we talk about a drug being safe and effective, doesn't mean it's without risks. And the FDA approval process evaluates whether the benefits outweigh the risks. And the drug labeling gives us information on how to identify and manage these risks. But not all risks may be known when the drug is approved. And so we do monitor the drug's safety after it is approved and is being used by the general population. And lastly, generic medications should work in the same way in your body and provide the same benefit as the brand equivalent. But there are some instances when you need to or should take the brand version. And so that wraps up the presentation. And so I'd like to go ahead and thank everyone who joined the session and to enjoy the rest of the day.